Do you have a wish list of games that you've always wanted to play, maybe for years, but haven't yet? Probably. I know I do. When I started this series, part of the appeal was that it would force me to actually start playing the games that I'd been putting off for various reasons. I'm constantly finding out about new games that I want to play, but for as long as I've been interested in retro titles, Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door has been at the top of my list. It's weird, I'd never played the series and I'm not even a big RPG fan, but I'd heard so many good things about this game that it felt like the holy grail of my wish list. For years it remained elusive, but I recently managed to get a copy at a reasonable price. After nearly a decade of waiting, I was finally playing The Thousand Year Door. Had I built it up too much in my head, or did it deserve its titanic reputation amongst fans of the series? When it comes to Paper Mario, had I been living under a rock? I normally like to have a pause here before we get into the video just to build the tension, but I just want to get this out of the way. This game was incredible. The first thing that really stood out to me, and probably the best thing about Thousand Year Door, is its tone. It's so fun and creative, and it felt incredibly refreshing when compared to the mainline Mario games that I was familiar with. I grew up playing the new Super Mario Bros. Series, and while those are great games on a mechanical level, they're quite repetitive in their presentation. I know it's a common criticism, so I won't get into it too much, but each game features the same generic Mushroom Kingdom world and Desert World and Water World and so on. I think that's partly what attracted me to the older Mario titles when I was younger, because they usually contained strange ideas or locations that weren't always brought back into the new series of games. The Thousand Year Door has such a vibrant, carefree attitude. It's full of fun characters, interesting locations, and it has a great sense of humour, things that I never would have expected in the safe but bland world of Mario. The characters were all fantastic. I struggled to know where to start. I loved Pennington, the penguin detective who constantly makes wrong deductions. Flavio was great too, a loud, swashbuckling pirate who's really a coward underneath all the bluster. It really made this world feel alive, that there were these characters walking around, popping up in various places, who all had backstories of their own. I could imagine the history of Grubber, who had spent years climbing up the ladder of the wrestling world, promoting fights and eventually becoming the head of the Glitz Pit. Or how Admiral Bobbery had spent years mourning the death of his wife, only for you to convince him to join your party where he learns to overcome his grief. Even the traditional Mario characters were well written and interesting, which was something I'd never experienced before. I loved seeing Luigi as this solo adventurer who would bore you with his elaborate stories only to be corrected by whatever character he was accompanied with at the time. Bowser was hilarious and one of the best characters in the game. He was written like a spoiled child, and his temper tantrums were so funny, seeing this big, powerful creature be so incompetent on his journey to open the Thousand Year Door. Even Peach felt like an actual character. She does get captured again, but whilst in captivity she has a series of conversations with the sentient computer, Tech, and together they try and understand the feelings it has developed for her. But by far my favourite character was Vivian. She begins the game as an antagonist, one of the three witches tasked by the X-Nauts with the job of hunting you down. Her sister Beldum is constantly belittling her and blaming her for their misfortune, which you see in various cutscenes. Whilst in Twilight Town, Dupliss steals Mario's body and Vivian helps the Shadow Mario, unaware that she is assisting her enemy. After realising Mario's true identity, she decides to join him permanently, inspired by his earlier kindness towards her, and the whole story is just really heartwarming. The characters were often very amusing in their design or personality, but this was only one example of the humour in Thousand Year Door. Professor Frankly will break the fourth wall to talk to the player and explain the plot, and later on an X-Naut in disguise will comment to the player about how obvious his disguise is. Pennington deduces that Bub would want a Game Boy Advance for his birthday, which I thought was quite funny, and I loved how the members of the Pianta Syndicate all talked. Their speech bubbles were all spelled phonetically to imitate a stereotypical gangster accent, and it was so silly, I loved it. You even befriend one of the bosses. After battling Cortez, he reveals that he can never be defeated, but once he realises you don't want to steal all his treasure, he just gives you the Crystal Star. He even becomes an ally in the fight against Lord Crump, and sticks around in Rogueport to take you to kill Horkey whenever you need. The game also managed to inject humour into its gameplay and design. At one point you need to track down Frankie and Francesca, who are engaged in an argument when you do find them. To placate Francesca, Frankie tells her that he loves her 100 times, so you have to sit through 100 speech bubbles of the same text over and over again. Later on, near the end of the game, you have to track down General White, and this journey takes you to every location you've been to previously. At the end of the search, you end up back at Far Outpost where you started, and learn that General White had been trying to find you the entire time. I can see how someone might find these sections annoying, but I admired their humour and the willingness to interrupt the game just for a silly joke. It's a great example of what made the Thousand Year Door feel so exciting on this first playthrough. One of the things that intrigued me about playing Thousand Year Door was the gameplay, especially the battle system. Aside from a few Pokemon games when I was a kid, I'd never played any turn-based RPGs, and I'd certainly never finished one before. The game's combat encounters are turn-based as I expected, but with small additions to make them a bit more interactive. When using certain moves, you can increase the damage caused if you press a button at a certain time. If you press A after an attack, you'll make it more stylish, which increases your applause and thus the amount of star power you receive for a successful move. When defending, you can reduce the damage you take by pressing A at the right time. Pressing B will actually harm the enemy who's attacking you, but it's harder to time this move successfully, increasing the risk of failure. It might not sound like much, but these additions completely transformed the battles for me and made them consistently interesting even after having completed several hundreds of them. It's a simple but effective way to increase engagement during fights. I never felt bored or tempted to sleepwalk through them because each new encounter was an opportunity to pull off a perfect attack or successfully deflect an opponent. There's a simple satisfaction in hitting a button at the right time, and the game capitalizes on this feeling for all it's worth. Once I acquired it, the Power Bounce badge became a particular favourite because it linked the damage I could deal to a specific skill. If I missed a button or became lazy at the controller, then my attack would be less effective. These features all made the battles feel more active and less about numbers and stats. For an RPG novice like me, it felt like a great introduction to this kind of game and ensured that the combat never felt like an interruption or a chore. The humorous tone and fun gameplay were both solid features that were maintained from start to finish, but equally important were the new and interesting locations, which kept the game feeling fresh throughout the long playthrough. The game is structured around your quest for the various crystal stars, with each star residing in a different location. This setup works so well thanks to the diverse range of locations and the satisfying gameplay loop of exploring them. Even the weaker places have a specific feature or something interesting to make them feel worthwhile. Take Petalburg. It was a fairly basic place and felt like the kind of bland Mushroom Kingdom type of location I was expecting to see, but Hooktail's castle more than made up for it. It felt like a Zelda dungeon, admittedly a very simple one, in the way you slowly built up an understanding of the geography. You would see things you didn't understand yet, before returning later with a new item or piece of information that would open up more of the building. My favourite location to explore was probably Keelhaul Key, especially once you get to the Pirate's Grotto. It took the dungeon approach of Hooktail's castle, only now with better puzzles, and the visual design was incredibly atmospheric. I could almost feel the spray of the water and the cold damp of the rocks. The Bogley Woods were probably the best looking location, with a beautiful black and white design that blew me away when I first saw it. For context, I was playing the original GameCube version on a CRT television, and I was stunned by how good this place looked. The puzzles involving the ever-increasing number of punies were also great fun. Then there was Twilight Town, which had one of the most challenging sections in the game for me, the winding section of the forest in between the town and the steeple. I remember being disappointed by how easy the final boss was, but the story content with Vivian was strong enough that I didn't mind too much. There's a section where Dupliss steals Mario's identity, and you have to fight him alongside all your other party members who believe you to be an enemy. However easy the fight was, the concept and idea behind it was incredibly creative, enough to make it feel satisfying to play. The final location was another highlight. The Palace of Shadow was another huge puzzle box with a great atmosphere too. The final boss was quite easy, but that might have been because I had beaten the pit of 100 trials before going through the Thousand Year Door. It was still a satisfying end to the game though. The number of great characters and exciting locations made the threat feel all the more pressing. I really felt connected to this world, and this meant that the final fight was still a rewarding experience. What really made the Thousand Year Door feel special though was how certain locations completely changed the style of the game. Look at Glitzworld, the third location you visit, discounting Rogueport. The main attraction is the wrestling arena, and the current champion has a crystal star attached to their belt. In order to get it, you have to beat them in a fight, and so the game essentially becomes a fighting game as you start at the bottom of the league and work your way up to the top of the pile. When I first played it, it was like the game stopped, taking a detour as you worked your way up the wrestling ladder. You have to fight about 20 times, but it never felt repetitive because I was honestly invested in getting to the top of the leaderboard. The promoter meets with you to discuss your progress, you hang out with other contestants in the locker room, and each fight has its own conditions that you have to adhere to, like not using your hammer or beating your opponent in a certain number of moves. If I had one complaint about this portion of the game, it's that the fights were too easy. The one time I struggled was when I had to take damage 5 times, but aside from that, I didn't lose a single fight. The Poshley Heights section was another great example of the game's fluidity when it comes to genre. You travel to Poshley Heights on the XS Express, but whilst on the train you learn of strange goings-on, at which point the Thousand Year Door becomes a detective game. You join forces with Pennington and travel around the train talking to suspects, uncovering hidden identities and trying to recover stolen items. Look, as detective games go, it's very basic. I'm not saying it suddenly becomes the Case of the Golden Idol or anything, which you can learn about here. It's basically a series of cutscenes that make you feel like you're being a detective. I know this because I tried to read Ghost T's diary and got a game over as punishment. I hadn't saved since boarding the train, and so I had to do the entire investigation all over again. Even though I knew that Burb wanted the train driver's autograph for his birthday, I couldn't just go to the driver straight away. I had to talk to everyone again, making me realise how rigid the process was. The superficial elements of the mystery genre were still enough to make an impression on me though, and once again, I just loved how quickly the game adopted a completely different tone and style. It nailed the atmosphere of a detective story with quirky characters and jazzy music, and I loved it. It reminded me of exploring the Momentary Express in Professor Layton and the Diabolical Box, one of my favourite games from when I was a kid. The train sequence was one of my favourite parts of the game, although I do think it made Poshley Heights feel like a weaker location once I arrived there. Most of the other locations opened up through exploration, but because you spend so much time on the train or in the intervening stations, Poshley Heights felt underdeveloped, especially coming so late in the game. At various intervals during the game, you even get a series of 2D Bowser levels in the style of a classic Mario platformer, complete with appropriate items and music. I don't think anything could better summarise this game's sense of fun, humour, and boundless creativity. I knew going in that the Thousand Year Door was very highly rated, and I hoped I would enjoy it as much as others did, but even I was surprised by just how good it was. It's an incredible game with so many little details that all work in service of such a polished experience. I loved exploring the Glitz Arena or Hooktail's Castle and watching the buildings shift and rotate as I walked around them. It gave these places a real sense of geography and perspective. I liked how every time Franklin would explain about the next star, his speech would start with the camera outside his house like a scene in a film. But most of all, I liked exploring this world, full of fun set pieces and interesting characters. Honestly, the more I played it, I started to get a bit angry. Not really angry, of course, but I just kept thinking, why are these characters not used more often? Why does Mario never meet them, or others like them, in his platforming games? Why don't his 2D games invent creative locations like the ones I explored here? Why have neither of the 2 Super Mario films incorporated these characters or taken inspiration from their more involved stories? The Mario games are fun, don't get me wrong. They're bright and colourful and very well made, but I've never played a Mario game and been amazed by its story or really invested in its characters. The story is usually there to get you from A to B, with characters that exist to fulfill basic functions: hero, villain, damsel in distress, etc. I know that platformers don't need all this, especially compared with an RPG which relies on its story and world building, but it can really improve the connection between the player and the game. You don't need much. I really enjoyed Celeste, and this was in part because of the story content which helped frame her journey in a satisfying way. It doesn't even need to be story related. Part of why I prefer the Donkey Kong Country games to the Mario platformers is that the setting feels so much more immersive. I feel like I'm going on a journey through an interconnected world rather than a series of obstacle courses. I know this is a tangent, but I just wanted to explain why I found the world of Thousand Year Door so intoxicating. I had become so familiar with Mario as a bland character that to experience a game set in his world that featured so much life and creativity was an absolute joy. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Under a Rock. I love sharing my first impressions of these classic or iconic games, and I've got some more that I want to cover soon. I haven't uploaded on this channel in a while, but I want to get back into it, and so I'm going to try and be more regular going forward. And the next video will be the Arkham City retrospective, so if anyone is interested in watching that, I promise it'll be out next. Feel free to check out the other 2 videos in this series, or any other videos on the channel really, and leave a comment if you want. I love hearing about your own experiences with these games. But whatever you choose to do or choose not to do, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.